Hi, this is Craig Stocks here for Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. And today we're going to look at how to combine data from two different systems. And I've done a video like this before, but I'm going to do this two different ways today. So I have data from the elephant trunk that were captured with two different systems. This was captured with the plane wave, CDK 12.5, kind of the little baby beginner plane wave. This was captured with the 16-inch Dream astrograph, which is a fast Newtonian, a little bit shorter focal length, so it has a larger field of view. These have both been processed through PixInsight, saved as 16-bit TIFFs, and then processed with my usual process in Photoshop. And I want to look at two different ways that we might combine the data from these two into one image. And we're going to be doing all this in Photoshop today. And I'm going to start with the simple approach. And I'm going to assume that these have each been saved as a JPEG or TIFF, but kind of a full-size image. So we would have the full-size finished from the Dream scope and from the plane wave. So let's look at how we would combine these finished images in Photoshop. So I'll start by going to File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack. And I'm going to do this because I want to load both of these files in the same Photoshop document. So there are the two finished. And these are JPEGs in this case, but you could use TIFFs just as easily. And I select those two and then click OK. And Photoshop will load those two images as individual layers within one document. So the way it loaded it, on top we have the version from the Dream scope, which is the wider field of view, and that's actually going to become the background. And then the closer view is from the plane wave. So the first thing I want to do is drag the plane wave image up on top, because we're going to need to resize this and align it to the image below. Now, I like to convert this to a smart object. And you do that by clicking to the right of the layer name. If I right-click and choose Convert to Smart Object. And the reason I like to convert it to a smart object is it's a very non-destructive method of working. And it lets you get back to the original without any degradation. So because we're going to be resizing this, it's possible we may not resize it perfectly the first time, and then we'll have to come back and adjust it. If it's a smart object, we don't lose anything. So for instance, if I resize this, let's say I resize it down to something really small, something like that, and click the checkbox to commit. Now, if this was a normal layer and we resized it down to this size, if I then wanted to enlarge it again, and I'm holding the Shift key to conform or constrain the size, you can see that we get basically back to the original. And that's because in a smart object it encapsulates the original, and then it applies non-destructive transformations, whether they're filters or transforms, to change the size or look of that original layer. So the original layer is in fact undisturbed. And if we want to get back to that original for some reason, I can just double click on the little smart object icon here, and that will open that layer as a layer by itself, and this is that original layer. So if we needed to, for instance, if we found a satellite trail that we needed to fix after the fact, we could come back, fix it here, and then save it back into the document, which it does automatically when you close it. So let's get this aligned, and to do that we're going to again use the free transform, Control T, and I'm going to put this layer, to start with I'm going to put it in lighten blending mode, and that lets us kind of see through this layer to see what's below, and we can start to roughly position it. And as we start to position it, we can see that some of these stars up here are starting to align. And so I'll zoom in, and I'm going to actually align this little star right here, because little stars tend to be more precise than large stars. So I'm going to align that. Now I want to use that as my center of reference. So to do that, in the very center of the image where these two diagonal lines cross, there's a little reticle, and you can click and drag that around. And if I drag that up and drop it over that star that we just aligned, now that becomes the center of this image. Whether I rotate it or resize it, it's going to resize or rotate relative to that point. Now we can look at the bottom of the image, and if I hold the Shift and Alternate keys, I can resize relative to the center. So everything is moving relative to that central point. And so now we're pretty close to aligned. And again, hold Shift and Alternate. So that looks pretty good, but let's fine tune it now. To fine tune, I'm going to change from lighten blending mode. And notice I haven't committed this. I could, but I don't need to. I can change from lighten to difference blending mode. And in difference blending mode, you can see very precisely. And now I'm going to use just the cursor keys to move this layer around and find a point where those stars appear to be perfectly aligned in this bottom corner. Now I'm going to drag the reference reticle down here, zoom into the top, and let's see what we need to do. Do we need to rotate? Looks like we mostly just need to refine that rotation just a little bit. Now that's perfectly aligned. The stars are aligned. I can commit this by clicking the check bar, and we'll change this back to normal blending mode. So right now all we've done is overlay this image onto the one below, and you can see there's the edges don't blend in perfectly. To fix that, I'm just going to add a quick layer mask. So I'll click the icon at the bottom right to add a layer mask, and then I'll grab the brush tool, and with black as my foreground color and 100% opacity, I'm just going to paint with a black brush on the mask, and you want to be sure you're painting on the mask and not on the picture, and that just hides those edges. So that's the mask that we just painted. Now, in order to blend this, if we want to average these two together, which is typically what you would want to do, since we have two layers, if you think about it, if we just average these two layers together, we would add this layer plus this layer and divide by 2, so each layer would represent 50% of the data. Well, in this case, we can change the opacity of this top layer to 50%, and that will basically make this a 50-50 blend. So now this top layer is 50% of the data, and the bottom layer, by default, is the other 50%. And we now have this image blended with this image. We've resized it. The stars are aligned, so we know everything is aligned. I can turn it off and on to see the difference. And it looks like it's just a little bit darker. So let's brighten it up a little bit. And to do that, I'm going to use a levels adjustment layer. And it's sitting on top of both of these layers. So right now it will affect the entire image if I change the levels. I really want it to affect just the layer it's on top of. So what I really want to do is clip this adjustment layer to this layer that we just added on top of the base layer. To do that, I'll use this leftmost icon in the Properties panel, and you'll notice that the Levels Adjustment layer indented itself a little bit, and there's a little arrow pointing down. That's indicating that this adjustment layer is clipped to the layer below it. So now it will only affect the layer below. And we can brighten it up a little bit, and that looks pretty good. So that's one way of doing it. And we've got a little bit of a transparent area over here, so I can just grab the crop tool, refine the crop, and there's our finished composite image. Sometimes it works out pretty well. It did in this case. The stars don't appear to be drastically different, but they are going to be different. And sometimes you only want the stars from one, even though you want the image from both. And really a better way of working is to go back to the original Photoshop files. So to do that, here is the original Photoshop file of the elephant trunk with the plane wave. Here is the version with the dream scope, and you can see these have all of the layers intact. Here's my sulfur, oxygen, hydrogen. I have RGB data in light and blending mode, and that adds a little bit of this detail up around the nose or the end of the elephant trunk. Have some global levels, color balance, hue saturation, and then the stars on top. So what I want to do is bring this entire image from the dream scope over on top of this image from the plane wave. So I'm going to grab this entire image, and just to keep everything together, I'm going to drop it into a layer group with Control G, select all layers, Control G. I'll label this PW for plane wave. And now I'll just drag it over to the other document, drag down into the image and let go. And so we've now just done a copy and paste of this entire image on top of this image. And if you recall, we have stars and everything, so we can align this layer group with all of the layers intact, just like we did on the other one. And it takes a few minutes because it's updating any smart objects that are in that layer group that we just copied over. I'll warn you, the computer may get a little laggy when we start adjusting it. So here's that layer group. And let's do the same thing. Now I'm going to Control T, and I'm going to take a risk and not convert this into a smart object. So there it's roughly aligned. We'll align a star up here. Now I'm going to move the center reticle up here, and we'll focus on the bottom part. Looks like we need to make it a little bit larger. And because I didn't turn this into a smart object, I want to try to get this as precise as I can the first time, so that if you resize more than once, you can, it's kind of like making a Xerox copy of a copy of a copy. You start losing fidelity. So I'm going to get these stars lined up as best I can, side to side. Make this just a little smaller. Oop, too small, a little bigger. And as long as I don't commit this, then everything should be okay. Okay, I'm going to switch now to difference blending mode. And fine-tune this with the cursor keys, focusing down on the bottom. And just like before, I'll drag the reference reticle to the bottom. We'll zoom in on the top. And now we're going to fine-tune this. This will be our final fine-tuning. It looks like we need to rotate a little bit. Sometimes the stars will completely disappear. Sometimes you'll just see little rings. Depends on whether the stars are the same size. That looks real good, so I'm going to commit this. So at this point, we're kind of at the same place we were before. The difference, though, and there's a couple differences, the main difference is that we can now work with just one set of stars instead of having two sets of stars where the layers are blended. So the first thing I might do is open up this group. Well, first let's go back to pass-through blending mode. So we can turn off these duplicate stars, and now we have only the stars from the layers down here. The other thing that I might want to do, and in fact we will do it, the layer structure here is the same between the dream scope and the plane wave. So I can actually combine, if I open up for instance the sulfur layer group, within the sulfur layer group we have a hue saturation adjustment layer that sets the color levels, a burning and dodging layer if we need it, and then here's the actual layer itself. So I can actually now open up the same layer from the dream scope, and I can just move this layer from the plane wave down here and combine these into one group. Let's do the same thing with the oxygen. Hopefully this all works out. I haven't practiced it. So here's our oxygen from the plane wave. We'll bring it down here and combine it with the oxygen from the dream scope. And lastly, the hydrogen. So now, at this point, I'm just going to turn off everything that we drug over from the plane wave. And each one of these layers that we just copied down, I'll put those at 50% opacity. And since the Move tool is active, I can just select the layer, tap the 5 key, and that will change the opacity to 50%. Let's see, that was hydrogen, oxygen, and sulfur. So that gives us a cleaner look. We still have to do some masking, and in this case we'll have to mask a little bit on each one of the files, or each one of the layers. So brush, 100% opacity. So it's not making much of a difference because I'm just on the sulfur layer. I can actually now copy, since I've gone to the trouble of creating this mask, I can copy this mask from here up to the oxygen layer by holding the alternate key, grab the mask, drag it up, and that copies it. Do that again to the hydrogen layer. And now we have those layers blended in line at 50%. If we want to blend the RGB, I didn't do that at the time. Let's close up the narrowband. Here's the RGB layer from the dream scope. If we come up to the plane wave, here's the RGB from the plane wave. And it has a little bit of retouching done to it, so I'm going to keep that retouching together and pull it down into the RGB. And now we have the same situation where we are blending this layer group at 50%. So now we have somewhat the same combination that we did back here. The difference is this is done at the individual levels, so each one of the layer groups is combined. They're getting the same color balance. We're getting the benefit of all of the data from both the dream scope and the plane wave. Hope you found this useful and not too confusing. When you start combining these. It does get to be a little bit of an advanced topic, but that's how you stretch and learn. So if you have any questions, be sure to drop those in the comments down below. And as always, I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky. Thanks.